Wow, so it's been a while since the last time I've streamed. Hmm, Like a month exactly. A lot of stuff has happened since then. Like I've been to the Netherlands on vacation and all of these new projects started popping in. And you might notice that I have a different background now. Um, I'm at the office. Yeah, I know it's the weekend, but when you commit to a deadline, it's usually a good idea to, you know, keep to your promise. Uh, been doing a lot of work lately with React Native. Not something I've been very experienced with, but something I've tried before. So really learning a lot now. And that React Native is probably going to be the topic of the next stream, which will hopefully be next week, maybe sooner. Uh, Still don't have a regular schedule, but you know, we'll think of something. And you may be noticing that there's like a little layout, like overlay now, not just my random face cam. Been experimenting with that as well. You might be noticing that there is like a chat topic above my head. So feel free to respond in the chat. Would be really eager to learn more about you guys. So when I last streamed, King Nothing, I believe, was the last follower to subscribe during that time. There's been new people since then. Thank you all for following, obviously. Uh, I appreciate the support. There's almost 60 of you now. And, real quick plug, you can follow me on Twitter, Danik Philip, like this. Same username. Actually, no, it's Philip Danik on GitHub. Uh, all the code that we write during this stream is posted in one of those repositories, so you can always keep up with it. You can copy it as snippets or for yourself or something, or maybe contribute your own solutions or something. Remember, we're currently working on this little gem, the Dungeons and Dragons initiative, which currently looks something like this, remember? So you can add new cards. This basically adds new characters to the mix. You can roll a die, and the list basically is sorted based on this initiative number. And there's videos on here on Twitch and YouTube of the previous sessions of how we built this, what were some of the thought processes behind this, and how we structured our code. And I'm looking to add 2 improvements to it and basically call it quits. It's serving its purpose. I'm actually using this in my Dungeons and Dragons sessions, so that's fun. 2 things I've noticed that are basically lacking, and that brings us to our first topic for today, and that's local storage. So remember how we currently have this screen, yeah? And I can fill in some information here, for example. But when I refresh this page, all of that is lost. The state has been lost because we've, basically restarted the application. And we're not persisting this data anywhere. Obviously, we don't have a backend service of some sorts out of scope for this project, but we still want to find a way to persist this information. And the way we're going to be doing that is using something called local storage. A local storage is basically like a programming interface provided by most browsers today. All the modern browsers and a lot of the older ones as well, which basically lets you save data to the local client by domain. So, this, for example, Google.com, it saves its local data based on its own domain. It can't access data that was saved on a different domain. So, for example, on Twitch, Twitch has its own local data, Google has its own local data saved on your client, and those two don't mix, obviously, because that would be a huge privacy and security concern. So how do you access local storage? Well, you literally write local storage like this. And as you can see, I already have stuff in my local storage, and it would, it's left over from previous applications that were hosted on localhost 3000. Uh, so I'm gonna try and like clear that. For example, I can do that in application in the Chrome debugger toollet list. You see all of your data there, and you can just clear it like that. That's the easiest way. Of course, you could reset the entire local storage programmatically, and now there's nothing inside of it. So how do you set data? Well, local storage exposes two main methods. One is called set item, the other one is called get item. So when you do something like this, and then you do like get item, notice that it was converted to, that the number was converted to a string. So everything is basically converted to a string. So if I did something like this and then try to get that, doesn't work like that. So you would have to do something like serialize this object and then use JSON parse to like decode it basically. So here I'm going to use JSON stringify, and now when I get that, it's returning the stringified version of the object that we saved, which you obviously then need to parse back. Good thing to note is that if you do JSON parse and then give it like an invalid stringified object, it will throw an error. So you might want to be aware that that can happen, and you would usually maybe wrap this in a try and catch block, for example. Depends on how you're doing error handling. But more importantly, this is a very low-level API in some sense. You're doing the getting and the setting directly, and if you want to get an entire list of everything, you have to do it very manually. Basically, you'd have to invent your own abstraction layer over what is essentially already an abstraction to enjoy the full benefits of working with this. And just to demonstrate, I'll like refresh this page, and you can see that like this is still there, obviously. And if I do this on a different host and a different domain, obviously that doesn't exist. It exists only within the scope of this domain and is accessible by your application. So where I was going is that just doing get item and set item directly on the local storage object might be something potentially dangerous and unclean for you to do. So yeah, making some sort of abstraction over that is potentially a better idea. And in your production applications, I would suggest using something like store2. It's a lightweight NPM module that exposes a different namespace called store. It goes down. It basically all translates down to local storage, but you're not the one who's directly manipulating local storage. And the API is a bit cleaner because you can just use store as a function or use set and get. No need to call it set item, get item. and it exposes other unique methods such as remove and get all and clear all. Um, yeah, I would recommend you use that instead of tingling on your own, basically. Um, in this stream, we're gonna. I was thinking we would just use the local storage object, but whatever. Let's use store directly, right? Let's let's learn how to work with different modules. That might be fun. Um, Another thing you may not know about is that uh, just like local storage, there is something called local session, or rather session storage. Uh, for all intents and purposes, it's similar to how local storage works, except that session storage is indeed uh, automatically deleted every time a session is ended. This basically ends a session. We're talking about a browser session, not a authentication session that you would be controlling via your server. So what's the deal with the storage again? Well, like I said, I want to be able to keep all of this in local storage, and whenever I refresh the application, I want the last known state to load automatically to preserve what I was working on. Okay, and we're gonna get into that now, I suppose. So let's add this to our project, right? So I'm using Yarn. Yarn add store2 will add this to project. Let me take a sip of coffee real quick. Well, that's lasting a bit longer than I would like. Yeah, no reason to stare at it full finish when it finishes. So the way we're going to be using it is we're going to be saying import store from store2, I believe. Or was it store-2? Store2. Right. So let me just check this is how the author exported the package. Yeah, that should be how the package is exported. So if we now do something like store get all, yes, excellent. So WebStorm finally loaded the library and all of its methods and definitions. And as you can see, get all returns this. And you know, another excellent thing about using store2 is you can see it immediately parsed the data for me. So if I used local storage and said get item B, remember it returns a string. But store2 handles all of this for me, so enabling me to express myself without writing too much boilerplate code that someone has already written and published. And you should always be taking advantage of this. If you're not, or if you're not, then you're just repeating yourself. Basically, don't repeat yourself. If nobody has solved the problem you're trying to solve, nobody has made this kind of utility, excellent idea is to write it by yourself and release it as, you know, a little module that you can reuse for yourself, and you know, other people might find it useful as well. So here's what we're going to do. we need to say something like this. So whenever our app loads, it assigns this initial state from the constants file as the current state. That's good, unless we have something stored already. So let's do something as trivial as store get, and I'm gonna call the key DND data. So if there is a value here, I want that to be used. If this is undefined or null, then use initial state. Okay. Next thing we want to do is basically serialize our state every time there's a change. So let me write a little function. Sync local storage, for example. Let's just call it sync state with local store. And it's basically going to be a method that does the following. It just says store set DND data this state. And now we would basically have to call this method every time there's some kind of change, which is a bit cumbersome because whenever update field or update initiative or sort elements or add card or remove card is called, there is some sort of change in our store, and doing this across every function, it works, it gets the job done, but it's a bit verbose. So potentially we might want to extract this in a different, more elegant way, perhaps. Something that's less verbose to read and easier to control and easier to manage. I mean, really, why is it important for this to work like that? It could just be a function that takes a parameter called state. So no need to reference this state object directly. Okay, that's one thing I want to do. Next is to find a way to basically wrap our functions with this one, in a way composing them per se. So how do we do that? Well, we can't extract all of these outside of the component necessarily because they are calling this set state directly, and it might be too much of a refactor to do that right now. What we could do instead is provide like a wrapper, perhaps. Actually, it's more potentially more complicated than I initially thought it would be. Let me think. What would be a good way to solve this issue? Huh. Well, that's interesting. I think I'll get back to that later. It's not as trivial as I thought it would be. That's fine. We don't want to optimize this prematurely. If you write it like this, you write it like this. That's fine. Don't worry too much about it. But we can pull off a more elegant solution using higher order components and function composition. I'm just not sure what a good way would be to write it without instanting every function all the time. So let's see if this works out of the box. Elements map is not a function. Okay. Let's see what was saved here. Well, hold on, that should be fine. Let's step into the debugger, and we're going to basically stop it right into constructor level. So here's the breakpoint. Let's see what store get returns. Store is not defined. Huh. So the constructor gets called sooner than that? Okay. What about moving all of this into component did mount? And yes, this is now a useless constructor. Can't read property elements of mount. Okay. Huh. Am I just unfamiliar with the syntax right now? Is that what's happening? Can't read property map undefined on line 87. Okay. Let's put a breakpoint there. Okay. So this state is obviously empty. Store is not defined. Hold on. Am I missing something here? Is store not something you can access? Actually have no idea why store is not defined. There's no constructor for the store that you need to call initially. Yeah, I'm honestly not sure. Let me give it an initial value though. And let that run. Elements map is not a function. So okay. That is okay. I see the problem. So it takes time for it to. So let's say like this. Now, if there is data, let's call it store data. Now, else we want to basically do nothing. Let the initial state load itself. Right, so a small overstep on my part there. Yeah, and there's our list. So now if we like mess around with some of these values, let's give them some names. Etc. Let's change these as well. And if we restart that, yeah, there's a slight delay there. Our initial values are shown before data is loaded. So we will indeed do it like this, for example. Yeah, perfect. So we solved that bug. Okay, and now we have a persistent memory storage basically. And like I said, if you go to your application here, you can see your data there, and you can clear your storage, add your own keys directly if you don't want to do it programmatically, whatever. Useful for debugging. Okay, great. So that's basically what I wanted to do with the local storage stuff, and really helpful that we had store2 to basically provide us with an interface that is better to use than the default one. So just a reminder, if you do something like this, returns a string, you have to serialize it yourself. If you use an abstraction like store2, you don't have to serialize it, and you have easier to use methods, and you're not directly writing code that uses local storage, which is an object globally present within the window. You usually want to avoid those. Okay, terrific. Next feature I wanted to add, one that might be pretty fun, and it's going to tie nicely into styled components once we add those later on. So this is good for tracking turn order. So right now, player 1 goes first, then player 2, then player 3, then let's say player 4. I'll actually let's give player for last turn. Yeah. This tells me like the order, but it doesn't tell me, it doesn't let me say whose turn it is right now. So what I want to do is I want to add a keyboard shortcut that whenever I press it, it basically toggles down indicator between these cards saying now it's player one's turn, and so on. And that's gonna be, you know, something that we're going to use a library, a library, a library like Mousetrap for. It saves us the hassle of binding our own listeners for keyboard events, because I want to do something like this, a combination of Command K or Control K, and I wanted to toggle something. So let's have fun with that. So we're going to be adding yet another library. Neither of these two libraries are too big. They expose a small API that does one specific thing and does it very well. You can see Mousetrap literally has no other dependencies of its own. It's vanilla JavaScript, basically. Something we should learn to appreciate more of, especially with newer syntax that actually makes sense. So I'm gonna import Mousetrap from Mousetrap, I suppose, and I'm going to define like basically we need another data structure for this. So we basically need to have either have one property that gives us the ID of the currently selected element, so which one should be highlighted, or we perhaps want to do it by index. Lots of options there actually. So let's maybe do it as a no, it's not current turn, it's current character, for example. No, that doesn't really express the logic I'm trying to achieve. Maybe just leaving it as current is fine, actually, when you learn how to spell it properly. Oh my god. Current. Is that how it's spelled? No. It's current, right? With the double R, right? This is so embarrassing. No, I wrote that previously, but Visual Studio WebStorm was correcting it. It does that sometimes. It lags behind, showing you an error message for something that was previously corrected, and then you get spooked. It's very spooky, right? So yeah, let's just call it current. I think that's fine. What we're basically going to be doing here is providing a prop that's like is current whenever the current index, whenever index is equal to current. And it's going to be a prop. And for now, just to make sure it works, I'm going to add something like this. If it's current, add a paragraph called current. We're going to be styling that in a better way. Right, but we don't have that in our local storage just yet because it's a new property. So I'm going to clear my storage, refresh this. So current is equal to 0 right now, but nothing is being shown. Let's jump into debugger really quickly. Current is undefined. Okay, so we didn't initialize the state properly. Why is that? Right, so now we do have store data and we do have current. Okay, so now we do have the proper Oh, okay, that's right. So next step, can't get inside of it. Never mind then. So it's probably there, I just can't see it. Oh, that's right, sorry. It's called isCurrent, not current. It's a Boolean. Oh man, I need more coffee. Like the type of bugs that I've been dealing with right now are so trivial they shouldn't even be a problem. Yeah. Okay, excellent. So that works. So what I'm going to do next is in our component did mount lifecycle, I'm going to use Mousetrap to bind something like command plus K, I believe is the syntax there. Yeah, but I want to provide two options. I want command plus K and control plus K. And whenever that's clicked, I want to call a method. For example, call it next turn. And next turn is going to be a method that does something incredibly simple. It's updating the current value here based on the previous one. So I take elements, current, and if current is equal to elements length minus 1, oh, put it like this. The new value will either be 0 because it's a new turn basically over there, or it's going to just increment by 1. And if it's already equal to the length of the elements minus 1, then we want to reset that to 0. Otherwise, we want the new value to be basically current plus 1 Then we're going to set state with current being the new value. Will the video be saved from the start? Yes, it will be uploaded. So the videos are uploaded to Twitch and YouTube. It's not done automatically. There's a couple of hours of delay. So thank you for joining us. Druids are awesome. You're from the Balkan region as well, I suppose? Serbia or somewhere nearby? So let's return this to see if it's working properly. Okay, and now that when I do Command K, Mousetrap should be listening on this, but it's not. Well, let's see why that is. Maybe we got the API wrong. Let's log something like oh, from my hometown. Awesome. Thank you for being with us, Druids. Okay. Mousetrap not being called properly. Oh, so the binding is a bit awkward actually. So can't have any of these spaces, I guess. I never really liked that API, but as you can see, as I click Command K, the turn order is basically being switched, and if we refresh the page, it should remember the order. No, why not? Aren't we saving count? Oh, that's right. So when we update this, we also need to call the sync function. So now that when I do this, so yeah, so that's remembering our positioning. Really cool. Obviously, we want to style the current card in a more prettier way than this. Right, and we're going to do that next with styled components. It's one of those things that's becoming really popular, so it might be useful to add that to your skill set. Right now, though, what I'm hoping to do before we go to that is talk a bit more about how Mousetrap is doing this and why we're placing it in component did mount. And as you can see, we've added quite a few things to component did mount here. So what is this method anyway? So this is something that's called a lifecycle method in React, and there's several of them. Component did mount being one of the most popularly used ones because it's ideal. It's essentially called when React has mounted this component into the DOM, into the document, into the object model, and this is a safe time to use stuff like set state or to do an asynchronous action or something like that. Although that's not usually always the case, but it's certainly a lot safer than doing that in component will mount, which is one of the most controversial, I suppose, parts of the lifecycle methods API, because component will mount, it's basically triggered before a component mounts, but the name implies that the component will actually mount when the more appropriate name for a component will mount is something like component will perhaps mount. And intuitively, you can assume that there is an inverse one, which is component did unmount and component will unmount. And for a long time, it's been a pattern that you start your event listeners in component did mount, and then you remove them in component will unmount, just because you don't want to have those leak and cause memory problems and calls to undefined functions and whatnot. Is it will unmount? Did they change that? React lifecycle methods. Let me check real quick. So have will mount, did mount, obviously. Yeah, they do have component will unmount. Did I misspell it, or is... No, that's just WebStorm criticizing the word unmount. So what we want to do is basically unbind the event listener for these event listeners whenever this component unmounts. Since app.js is literally our root component, the application doesn't really exist if this component isn't mounted, so this isn't really that important. This is important for components that are below in the model, but it's always a good practice to do this, obviously. Okay, so let's keep going forward. That's Mousetrap. It's pretty cool. What we wanted to do in this stream as well is introduce styled components. So what are styled components, and why styled components specifically? Surely there are other like libraries that perhaps solve the same problem that styled components solves. The answer to that is unfortunately very dull. I'm just simply more familiar with styled components than other libraries that do this. And what they're basically doing is providing you with a way to write your CSS within your JavaScript files, within your component files. Basically helping you separate concerns in a way, or it's not really separating concerns, it's shifting them. So what you're doing is you're putting your CSS along with your components layout, your component logic. It can all be within the same file, or at least within the same directory, but the reason why you're shifting it is perhaps you're now causing while you have done a separation of some concerns, you no longer have this separation of technologies. So it's not like CSS does this, JS does that. It's now one thing that's sort of like meshed together. And if you're not careful, you can write really crappy code. But ideally, you're actually going to be writing components that make a lot more sense, because one of the main benefits of this is that theming components is easier, applying specific styles based on some interaction is also easier, and most importantly, you're no longer managing CSS classes, which is like a whole bag of worms in itself. And most importantly, you're not losing uh, one of the most important things about CSS, which is the cascade part. You know, writing styles that do cascade. You can still do this with styled components. So how do they work? Well, let's look at the demo site as I add yet another dependency to our project. And by the way, at the end, styled components compiles, I believe, to regular CSS. So you're not shipping some junk to the end client with like inline styles. Well, there is some inline styles in there, but a lot of it just compiles down to regular CSS classes that are obfuscated, and they're used inside the browser as regular CSS. What's changing basically is the way you're thinking about it and the way you're writing your code. So what happens when you add this is, well, let's start abstracting things one by one. For example, our button. So let's import styled from styled components. And previously this button class, as you can see, it's just a simple HTML button which receives a class from some external source. The reason we've done this is because we have several different types of buttons, I suppose, and we wanted them to be themable in this sense. So like this is a button, but this is also a button, and this is a button. Yeah, whatever. We can do that a bit differently. It's not necessarily better, but it's different. So the way we styled our buttons here is using this selector. Let's not do that, and let's get rid of class name and say something like const styled button, and then we're going to use styled, and then we use this. So what this is doing is it's basically creating a React element with this basic one button, and what follows here in these template literals is the CSS code. So if I come here and I copy all of this over there, and I do something like this, for example, and then replace this element with this sort of like stylized element, what should happen is exactly this. And as you can see, this one changed styles as well, obviously. And the hover interaction is there as well. Excellent. Okay, so that works for like simple HTML elements, for example, input, button, anchor link, whatever. What about styling other React components? You could also do that as well. Instead of using this syntax, let's say we imported some kind of button from somewhere else. What we could have done to style that is do this. So what that will do is basically take an existing component and wrap it in your style sheets. Awesome, terrific. So that's already a kind of improvement. I'm curious to hear what you guys think about this. Do you inherently like this idea of having your CSS here? It doesn't necessarily have to be in the file itself. You could keep it in a different file and then just import it, you know. But the idea is that the styling exists at the same place where the layout is and the same place where the logic is. It's it's no longer a separate file and separate scope somewhere else that you get with regular CSS. So that's a basic example of doing that. But what if you want to apply some conditional logic to these styles? For example, I want this button to look a bit different than these ones. I want it to have, let's say, a darker color. So or let's put it like this. I want the opacity to be larger than 0.5, you know? Well, we can introduce props for that. So that's this button. I'm going to introduce another prop. Let's call it let's call it bold, for example. So bold is set to true. And what I want that to happen when I do that is to have the opacity. And this is where, some cool tricks start to happen. So if there is a props called bold, I want this to be like 0.75, otherwise keep it to 0.5. I also want font weight to be 700. Otherwise, make it 400. And what you can see is that this button is now different. And we were able to control this using a simple prop called bold equals true. Instead of assigning different classes and composing those CSS classes. Now, there's no objective way of saying which approach is better. But there are, I believe, situations where this is easier to understand and to figure out because everything is in one place. I don't have to go and look through some SAS files, then find their variables, and then see how they compile down to CSS, and then think about overriding that. Everything is localized. And this idea of localizing everything, including the styling and the logic of a component, basically ceding all control to the component itself, is, I believe, very powerful. And a lot of the community seems to think so as well. But again, I repeat this often, there's nothing wrong with just using regular CSS. In fact, there's no reason why you wouldn't approach a project with the mindset of using both of these. Sometimes, it makes sense to use regular CSS, especially if you have third-party components that you can't override in any other way than writing your own CSS. That's perfectly fine. So yeah, that's the basic idea that we wanted to accomplish, or rather showcase with the style components. So now let's change this card component into a style component as well, and find a way to highlight the selected component. So, what I'm going to do here is, I'm going to import style components as well. I'm going to create constant called wrapper that's going to basically be a div. I'm essentially replacing this div right here. And what I want to open is index.css. No, it's app.css. And I want to copy all of these styling rules and apply them here. So this will apply them to the card itself. This will cascade down to the inputs. This will cascade down to the labels. We'll extract those later as well. And we want to cascade this down as well. And now we can just, no. And there you go. So refactoring regular CSS into styled components is very natural. It's the same syntax, and as you can see, it's pretty easy to pull off. Extremely easy, actually. So I'm satisfied with this for the time being. I think you guys get the general idea. To reiterate why this is really cool, we're going to supply the wrapper with, a property called highlight, and we want to, I don't know, a different box shadow maybe. Is that what we want? Or maybe add some borders. Yeah, so whenever highlight is provided, let's add a border around this. Not sure if this is a valid CSS color. Yeah, it's a valid CSS color. It doesn't look perhaps too pretty, but I think you guys get the general idea. I mean, let's make the box shadow different as well. This actually internally creates different classes. Like I said, it compiles down to something different. So repeating the box shadow command isn't necessarily going to result in your CSS having two box shadows as well. I'm not sure if you can see that properly in development. Yeah, you can see that. So what's happening now is you can see that these are basically classes that have been created by styled components. And the final output from styled components will be CSS files with these classes. So nothing has dramatically changed. This isn't inline CSS. Important. Inline CSS is not the best option for styling anything, really, anything remotely large. This is still plain old CSS the model in which you think about it has changed a bit, and the way you write it has changed a bit, but it's still the same syntax, and it's essentially still compiling and being provided to the end user, to the browser, uh, the way it has always been. So, yeah, I'm pretty satisfied with this. I think we've accomplished quite a few things today. Uh, we've implemented basically some local storage uh, to our uh, to our little app. Uh, we've implemented a new feature with order tracking that is bound to some keyboard commands, uh, Control K and Command K, obviously supporting Mac OS, Linux, and Windows at the same time. And we've also, we've gotten our feet wet with styled components. Uh, Although we've really scratched the surface, like styled components exposes so much more stuff that's definitely worth looking at. And if you're interested in adding styled components to like your skill set, I recommend going through all of this. Well, in some order. You don't have to go through it in this exact order, obviously. But what's really like most impressive, I suppose, about style components is the theming mechanism. This idea of having theme providers wrapping that essentially like wrap your components. So here, for example, you can see this is a button and this is also a button, but this one is wrapped in a theme provider. And what's happening here is you're accessing it through props, theme. It's basically inserting a new form of prop. And that's essentially pretty powerful because it allows you to have alternate versions of components. Uh, it allows you to make themable applications, themable uh, workspaces. Uh, Excellent example of this in like the real world. We have a client who provides, you know, let's just say access control software that comes with a web application that lets you monitor and configure everything. And this is bundled differently for every of their clients specifically, which means it has to look differently. Basically, we're providing a mechanism for you to white label it, and if you can do that from one single point, which is the theme, like just specify a different theme every time a new client comes around, uh, it makes it extremely easy to change the entire UI on a whim. That's one use case. The other is obviously what they're showing here is you have a base design and then you have different variations of it. Obviously very common with input elements and buttons and generally interfaces. So yeah, that's basically all that I had planned for today. It was a little improvised and we had some unfortunate bugs at the start, but if you're new to this, it's probably good to see that everyone has hiccups and that it's important to keep a clear head and use your tools to log and debug and find the end solution. So unless you guys in the chat have any questions right now, I think we're going to end the stream. Like I said, I'm in the office today. I'm gonna go home after this, which is why the background is a bit different. Oh, and you may have noticed the new overlay. Uh, I saw that these things are pretty popular on Twitch, so I kinda made one. Makes it look more interesting, I suppose. And it's the same color as the Twitch brand, so everything is on point. Alright guys, thank you all for tuning in. The video will be uploaded here on Twitch, it will be uploaded on YouTube, and if you've missed it or you want to go over some things that we've done today, you'll be able to do that. So, thank you all for joining me, and have a great day. Have a great weekend, actually. Hope you're gonna party or spend this time with loved ones or something. Peace out, guys.